brought down, information which may shed light on what the passengers and the crew were doing and may help reveal who carried out the attacks and why. More from CNN's Miles O'Brien.
Nothing seemed amiss when American Airlines Flight 11 left the runway in Boston Tuesday morning. The 767-200 was about half full, toting 81 passengers, a cockpit crew of 2, and 9 flight attendants to the opposite coast. The captain likely planned for a 5-hour flight, so there was roughly 8,500 gallons of jet fuel in its 3 tanks. FAA radars tracked the airliner as it followed the flight plan. But then, about 20 minutes into the flight, somewhere over upstate New York, it turned sharply to the south. Flight 11 was hijacked, apparently by knife-wielding men. Airline pilots are trained to handle such situations by keeping calm, complying with requests, and, if possible, dialing in an emergency 4-digit code on a device called a transponder. It transmits crucial flight data to air traffic controllers. The action takes seconds, but it appears no such code was entered. But in the cabin, a frantic flight attendant managed to use a phone to call American Airlines Command Center in Dallas. She reported the trouble, and according to the Christian Science Monitor, a pilot apparently keyed the microphone, transmitting a cockpit conversation. The hijackers could be heard saying, "We have more planes, we have more planes." Radio transmissions like this would have been recorded on the ground by the FAA.
The police have identified 5 suspects that they believe were involved with this terrorist act, and 2 of whom may be brothers, apparently, reportedly. 2 of whom, 2 others, may have flown in from Portland and originated in Canada.
About 5 minutes before Flight 11 started heading south, another 767, United Flight 175, left Boston, also for Los Angeles, 65 souls aboard. 15 minutes after becoming airborne, it veered off course. One passenger made 2 calls to his father. In one exchange, he said a flight attendant was stabbed. In the second call, he told his dad the plane was going down.
They knew not to carry guns on the airplane if they fired off a bullet. I mean, they could have had explosive decompression on the aircraft. They knew what they were doing, and they knew what their mission was, obviously.
We know what happened next. The 767 struck and ultimately leveled the World Trade Center's Twin Towers.
I know pilots. No, if you're going to die, you're not going to fly in a World Trade Center to do it. Yeah, there would be a struggle, major struggle.
By 8:20, the third hijacked flight, American Flight 77, a 757, left Dulles Airport outside Washington, again bound for Los Angeles with 66 people on board. Radar tracking information on this flight obtained by CNN seems to indicate the transponder was turned off, which would have made it tougher to see on radar. We do know this. An hour and 20 minutes after departure, it plowed into the Pentagon. On board was Barbara Olson, a well-known attorney and frequent CNN legal commentator. Huddled in the back of the plane, Olson called her husband twice from her cell phone. She described the frantic scene.
She said that they were armed with knives and box cutters, cardboard cutters.
Even as the focus shifted to the nation's capital, a 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, bound for San Francisco out of Newark, takes a sudden 180-degree turn near Cleveland. More than one of the 38 passengers called their families to offer final goodbyes.
He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And then the phone went dead.
The 757 began homing in on the Washington area, its target unknown. But this flight did not make it that far. It crashed into a cornfield in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Was there a struggle in this cockpit? The military denies it was shot down. Pilots assessing this horrific sequence of events to a person believe the hijackers were in control of the 3 planes that hit their targets and that they must have been well schooled in aviation.
No, these people were well qualified on the airplane. They knew the systems, they knew the navigation, and they knew the flight management system, the computers, and they knew navigation. I mean, they went from Boston and right down to New York. I mean, They had to know which way to turn.
Miles O'Brien, CNN.
And with investigators turning much of their attention to Boston, let's turn now to Boston Herald reporter Jonathan Wells, who's been tracking the hijacking probe. He joins us, as we just saw, from our Boston bureau. Jonathan, what do we know about how these hijackers managed to board these two planes at Logan Airport in Boston?
Well, that part of the story is really yet to come out, how they actually got on the planes, other than apparently their purchase of 7 of the tickets that were used for the 2 flights were purchased with a credit card, a common credit card, which helped the FBI detain 3 individuals at the Westin Hotel today in Boston who are apparently associates of the hijackers. But how they actually get on the plane, the mechanics of that, I don't know.
And what do you know, if anything, about their whereabouts just before they got to Boston? Had they been in Boston for some time, or did they get there only just before the flights?
Well, here's what we understand. At least 2 of the hijackers apparently came down from Canada, we believe through Nova Scotia, boarded a ferry to Maine. From Maine, either getting off at Bar Harbor or Portland, Maine. They then eventually ended up on a flight to Boston. Now, there apparently may be other hijackers that entered through Canada by a different route, possibly by car. Overall, what we've learned is that a terrorist cell was apparently operating in Massachusetts, had its members traveling to Canada at various times, it appears, had been operating in Massachusetts for some time leading up to this. We've heard mention of Springfield in Western Mass as a post for some of these people. And essentially, they were able to hatch this plot in Massachusetts to some extent and use Massachusetts as a staging area for the attack on New York.
Jonathan Wells of the Boston Herald, thank you very much for joining us. And there is a widespread belief that yesterday's attack succeeded because of major security and intelligence failures. Joining us now, the former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, Larry Johnson, he's a former State Department counterterrorism official, and Senator Richard Shelby, he's the ranking Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Senator Shelby, tell us, first of all, what do we know right now? What do you know right now about who may have been responsible for these attacks?
Well, this investigation, as you know, is ongoing. I was in a briefing with the Attorney General and the FBI Director earlier this afternoon. I won't comment on that. But I can tell you, Wolf, I said last night, I've said it again today, there are certain parallels, I believe, between what happened yesterday, in some sense, with what happened to our embassies in Africa 3 years ago. Think of the timing. The first thing that came to my mind was the parallel between the precise timings of these bombings. In this case, it was the airplanes, but timing's important. Timing's always been important to Osama bin Laden and his group. Now, was it Osama bin Laden, or was it some similar cells? We'll wait for the investigation. I got a belief it's linked.
Director Woolsey, a lot of people say that the signature of Osama bin Laden is all over these attacks. Are you ready to draw that conclusion?
It may be all over these attacks, and I think that might make us a bit suspicious that something else may be up. Certainly, bin Laden may well have been deeply involved and may have been the operational figure and his people in this, but that doesn't mean that he acted alone. When I see bin Laden issuing fatwas, religious edicts, putting out videotapes, issuing poems, having his subordinates talk about how they're taking part in terrorism against the United States, I begin to think that maybe we're supposed to focus solely on bin Laden, and there might be something else in train. My suspicion, it's no more than that at this point, is that there could be some government action involved together with bin Laden or a major terrorist group, and one strong suspect there, I think, would be the government of Iraq.
Larry Johnson, the government of Iraq sponsoring this act of terrorism, is that your sense as well?
No, I think that's highly unlikely for several reasons. Principally, Iraq right now has been winning the political battle against the United States in the effort to lift sanctions. Secondly, the only recorded terrorist attack we have by Iraq against the United States was the attempt in February of 1993 to kill then former President George Bush Sr. Saddam is a lot of things, but he's not crazy. And the motivations for him at this point to launch an attack that's not just killing Americans, but has probably killed people from as many as 40 different nations in the World Trade Center, which would turn the world against him at a time when he's been making progress in the United Nations and getting sanctions lifted. I think, we should not ascribe to him that kind of idiocy.
So let me just move on to Senator Shelby, Larry Johnson, but before I do, very, very quickly, if it's not Iraq, is it your sense it is just Osama bin Laden?
The only person over the last 8 years, the one that we know for sure that has killed the majority of Americans in terrorist attacks is Osama bin Laden and groups linked to him. And that's not a matter of opinion now. We have that as a result of the U.S. Embassy bombing trials from East Africa earlier this year. Moreover, and one final point, in that trial, evidence emerged that demonstrated that Osama bin Laden had prior meetings and contacts with Imad Mughniyeh, the Hezbollah chief who was involved with the bombing of the Marine barracks, bombings of U.S. embassies, hijackings of airplanes. And the reason he wants to emulate Mughniyeh is because Mughniyeh succeeded in driving the United States out of Lebanon.
All right, Senator Shelby, you're the ranking Republican, the ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the former immediate past chairman. I want to read to you a line from what William Safire, the New York Times columnist, wrote today. He said this: "The next attack will probably not be by a hijacked jet, for which we will belatedly prepare. More likely, it will be a terrorist-purchased nuclear missile or a barrel of deadly germs dumped in a city's reservoir." That's pretty alarming kind of stuff. Is it far-fetched?
I don't think anything's far-fetched. We've been trying to prepare for weapons of mass destruction. On the Intelligence Committee, I, Senator Graham, and others have tried to alert the American people to that. We have training to deal with terrorists now, the first responder program, people that would destroy our water supplies, do other things. I think it would probably come in a chemical attack first, but that's just my hunch.
Director Woolsey, yesterday I spoke to Paul Bremer, former State Department and ambassador for counterterrorism. He made the point that in 1995, the CIA effectively stopped recruiting agents in some of these terrorist cells, perhaps out of concern that Congress wouldn't like the fact that they were putting on the U.S. government's payroll some sordid, very nasty figures, and that could have undermined human intelligence gathering capabilities by the United States. Is that a fair point he makes?
Jerry and I very much agree on that. He chaired the Commission on Terrorism that I served on. This is some guidelines that were put out a few months after I stepped down as director. They grew out of the Jennifer Harbury Bamako mess in Guatemala. And the upshot is that the CIA has guidelines now that don't block it from recruiting people with violent backgrounds as spies, but they do somewhat deter it and inhibit it. And, you know, there are a lot of good people trapped inside bad governments who want to work for the United States, and that might be one way that is one way we get spies who help us in governments. But inside bin Laden's organization, or Hezbollah, there are only people who want to be human rights violators. So if you don't recruit human rights violators, you don't recruit people inside terrorist organizations. And I think Jerry is on the right track with that. I think those guidelines, particularly with respect to terrorist recruitments, ought to be changed.
So by all accounts, therefore, Larry Johnson, would you characterize this failure, this is an intelligence failure, these 4 attacks, these 4 hijackings yesterday, and the devastation that resulted from them?
In one sense, but this is not to assign blame. What really is going on here is the CIA is set up and structured much like the U.S. cavalry was before World War II. Horses had no place in World War II, yet it was still a part of the Army. And unfortunately, most of our intelligence apparatus overseas is structured to still deal with the Cold War. And there have been efforts to change it. But, and again, I'm basing this upon, I've got several friends who are in senior positions as case officers. The morale is terrible. There is a risk-averse culture, and Director Woolsey put his finger on it. These folks are just not able to penetrate what they need to, because we as this country, we can't decide whether we want to kill the rats who are in the sewer, but we don't want to get into the sewer. So therefore, we want to stay out of the sewer, but we want the rats dead. And we've got to make a choice at some point.
Senator Shelby, you'll have the last word. How do you resolve that dilemma that Larry Johnson and Director Woolsey just spoke about?
Well, I think we're going to have to beef up